Chongqing, China, May 1942. James Doolittle stood in a farmhouse courtyard watching Chinese soldiers load his crew into a truck. The building was mud brick with a tile roof. Chickens wandered between wooden posts. An older man, perhaps 60, stood near the doorway. He wore a padded jacket and cloth shoes. His hands were calloused from farm work. He had hidden Doolittle for 3 days after the bailout, fed him rice and vegetables, gave him his own sleeping mat, asked nothing in return. Doolittle walked over and extended his hand. The farmer took it. Doolittle did not speak Chinese. The farmer did not speak English. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Doolittle said, "Thank you" in English because it was all he had. The farmer smiled and nodded. A nationalist officer said something in Chinese and gestured toward the truck. Time to leave. Doolittle released the farmer's hand and climbed into the truck bed with his crew. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked back. The farmer stood in the courtyard watching them go. Doolittle raised his hand in a final wave. The farmer waved back. Then the truck turned a corner and the farmhouse disappeared. Doolittle did not know the farmer's name. He never learned it. 3 months earlier, Doolittle had been testing fuel additives for Shell Oil Company in California. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and he returned to active duty. The Army Air Forces needed experienced pilots. Doolittle was 45 years old with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering and more flight hours than most men half his age. General Henry Arnold called him to Washington in January and gave him a problem. President Roosevelt wanted to bomb Japan. The problem was distance. Japan sat 3,500 miles from the nearest American base. No bomber in the inventory had that range. Arnold asked Doolittle to find a solution. Doolittle proposed launching Army bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier. Medium bombers, not the heavy 4-engine models, specifically the B-25 Mitchell. It could carry a meaningful bomb load, and with modifications, it might be able to take off from a carrier deck. Landing back on the carrier was impossible. The aircraft would fly to China after the attack and land at nationalist airfields. The Chinese would help the crews return to American lines. Arnold approved the plan. Doolittle spent February and March training crews at Eglin Field in Florida. By April, 16 modified B-25s were loaded aboard the carrier Hornet and sailing toward Japan. The raid itself happened quickly. On the morning of April 18th, the task force launched early after spotting Japanese patrol boats. Doolittle took off first. His aircraft climbed away from the carrier and turned west. The other 15 bombers followed. They flew across 600 miles of ocean at wave-top height and reached Japan shortly after noon. Doolittle's bombardier released 4 500-pound bombs over northern Tokyo. The aircraft banked away and descended back toward the water. Total time over the target was less than 3 minutes. The 16 bombers scattered and headed west toward China. Then the fuel ran out. The early launch meant none of the aircraft had enough gas to reach the designated airfields. Darkness fell. Weather closed in. Doolittle's crew bailed out over Zhejiang province around midnight. He pulled his ripcord at 8,000 feet and descended through rain and clouds. He hit the ground hard in a rice paddy and lay there for a moment, making sure nothing was broken. Then he stood up, collapsed his parachute, and started walking. He had no idea where he was. He walked for hours in darkness until he saw lights from a village. He approached cautiously. Dogs barked. A door opened, and a man came out holding a lantern. That man was the farmer. The farmer could have turned him over to Japanese forces. Japanese patrols were searching for the American raiders. There were rewards offered for their capture. Instead, the farmer brought Doolittle inside, gave him dry clothes, and hid him in a back room. Over the next 3 days, other villagers brought in 2 more members of Doolittle's crew. The Chinese fed them, treated their injuries, and sent word to nationalist forces. When soldiers arrived, they explained through an interpreter that Japanese troops were searching the area. The Americans needed to move quickly. During those 3 days, Doolittle watched the village. He saw farmers working their fields, children playing in the dirt streets, women carrying water from a well. It was a poor village. The people had little. They shared what they had anyway. On the second day, an older woman brought him a bowl of rice and some vegetables. She set it down, smiled, and left without waiting for thanks. He ate slowly, aware that this food came from someone's personal ration. He did not know how to repay them. He had no money, no supplies, nothing to offer except his gratitude. On the morning of departure, the nationalist officer explained that they would travel by back roads to avoid Japanese checkpoints. It would take several days to reach safety. Doolittle asked about the villagers. Would there be reprisals if the Japanese discovered they had helped Americans? The officer said it was possible. He said the villagers understood the risk. He said they helped anyway because Americans were allies, and allies help each other. Doolittle asked if there was anything he could do to protect them. The officer said no. He said the best thing Doolittle could do was leave quickly and let the villagers return to their normal lives. The Japanese would have no reason to suspect them if the Americans were already gone. So Doolittle left. The truck carried him and his crew south through Zhejiang province. At each village, they stopped and picked up more crew members. Civilians had hidden them, fed them, guided them to safe houses. By the time they reached nationalist headquarters, Doolittle had accounted for 64 of his 80 crew members. 3 had died in crashes. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. The rest were safe. Chinese civilians and soldiers had saved their lives. Doolittle flew back to the United States in late April. He expected court-martial for losing 16 aircraft. Instead, he was ordered to report to the White House. On May 19th, President Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on his uniform in front of a room full of reporters and photographers. The citation praised his leadership, courage, and tactical brilliance. Roosevelt promoted him from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general on the spot. Newspapers called it the most rapid promotion in Army history. Doolittle stood at attention while flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions. That afternoon, he gave his first interview. A journalist from the New York Times asked what it felt like to be a hero. Doolittle said he was not a hero. He said his crews were the heroes. He said the Chinese who saved their lives were the heroes. The journalist wrote it down, but the headline the next day read, "Doolittle, hero of Tokyo raid, receives Medal of Honor." The story mentioned the Chinese in passing, one sentence near the end. Doolittle attended war bond rallies. He appeared in newsreels. He gave speeches at aircraft factories. Everywhere he went, people wanted to hear about the raid. They asked how it felt to bomb Japan. They asked if he was scared. They asked if he would do it again. He answered their questions. He described the takeoff from the carrier. He described seeing Tokyo below. He described bailing out in darkness. He did not talk much about the Chinese. When he did mention them, he said they were brave and generous. He said they saved American lives at great risk to themselves. Then someone would ask another question about the bombing, and the conversation would move on. The Army Air Forces assigned him to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa. He deployed in September. He led bombing campaigns in Tunisia and Italy. He was promoted to Major General. In 1944, he took command of the 8th Air Force in England. He flew combat missions over Germany. The war consumed his attention. He rarely thought about China. When he did, he remembered the farmer's face, the smile, the wave goodbye. He wondered sometimes what happened to that man after the Americans left. He wondered if the Japanese came asking questions. He did not know. In June 1942, shortly before deploying to North Africa, Doolittle received a letter from General Claire Chennault. Chennault commanded the American volunteer group in China, the fighter pilots known as the Flying Tigers. He had been in China since before the war started. He knew the situation on the ground. The letter was classified. Doolittle read it standing at his desk in his quarters. Chennault wrote that Japanese forces had launched a major offensive in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. The offensive targeted the Chinese civilian population. Japanese units were destroying villages, burning crops, executing civilians. The stated purpose was retaliation for Chinese assistance to the Doolittle raiders. Chennault said the operation was systematic and large-scale. He said the Japanese were targeting any village or town suspected of helping the Americans. He said the death toll was significant. He said future air operations should avoid using China as a recovery area because the Chinese population was paying too high a price. He said the people were still willing to help, but it was not right to ask them anymore. Doolittle read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his desk drawer. He sat down in his chair and looked at the Medal of Honor in its presentation case on his shelf. The medal was gold suspended from a blue ribbon. Doolittle's name was engraved on the back along with the date, April 18, 1942. The day he became a hero, the day his bombs fell on Tokyo, the day he bailed out over China and Chinese farmers risked their lives to save him. He tried to calculate how many villagers had helped his crews, at least a dozen in the first village where he hid. Similar numbers in other villages along the route. Hundreds of people total across the province. All of them now at risk. All of them targeted because they had helped Americans. He thought about the old woman who brought him rice, the farmer who gave him his sleeping mat, the nationalist soldiers who guided them to safety. He thought about Chennault's phrase. The death toll was significant. He closed the desk drawer with the letter inside. He looked at the medal again. He wondered if the farmer was still alive. He wondered if the village was still standing. He did not know, and there was no way to find out. The letter from Chennault contained no names, no specific locations, just a general description of a large-scale operation across 2 provinces. Doolittle had no idea which villages were affected. He only knew that people who helped him were dying because they helped him. He reported to North Africa 2 weeks later. The medal went with him, packed carefully in his luggage. He never responded to Chennault's letter. There was nothing to say. The raid was over. The mission was complete. The medal had been awarded. The Chinese were dying, and there was nothing Doolittle could do about it except carry that knowledge forward. So he did. He commanded his Air Force. He flew his missions. He won his battles. He became one of the most successful commanders of the war. And he did not speak about the letter. Not to his staff. Not to his family. Not to reporters. He kept it in his desk drawer and later in a file box with other classified correspondence from the war. The farmer's face stayed with him. The wave goodbye. The smile. the hand extended in trust toward a stranger who brought nothing but trouble. Doolittle received the second letter from Chennault in late August 1942. He was in North Africa preparing for Operation Torch. The letter arrived with other classified correspondence in a diplomatic pouch. Doolittle opened it, standing at his desk in his quarters at Tafarawi Airfield. The afternoon heat made the metal walls of the building radiate warmth. He had a fan running, but it only moved hot air around the room. Chennault's letter was 3 pages typed on thin paper. The first page summarized Japanese military operations in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces between May and August. The second page contained casualty estimates compiled from nationalist intelligence sources. The third page was Chennault's assessment and recommendation. Doolittle read all 3 pages without sitting down. The Japanese operation had been systematic. Units of the 13th Army entered villages suspected of assisting the Doolittle raiders. They questioned headmen. If assistance was confirmed, they executed the headmen and burned the villages. If assistance was suspected but not confirmed, they destroyed anything that could support future operations. Airfields, radio stations, roads, bridges, grain storage facilities. In some areas, Japanese forces used biological weapons, cholera, plague, anthrax. They contaminated wells and food supplies. The diseases spread through civilian populations. Chennault's casualty estimate appeared on the second page in a single line. 250,000 Chinese civilians killed. The number sat there on the page without elaboration. Doolittle read it twice to make certain he understood it correctly. 250,000. He looked at the number and tried to comprehend what it represented. He thought about the villages he had seen in Zhejiang, small farming communities, maybe 200 people per village, sometimes less. 250,000 meant more than 1,000 villages. Complete destruction of every village that helped his crews, and every village near those villages, and every village that could theoretically help future American operations. He sat down at his desk. The letter was still in his hand. He read Chennault's recommendation on the third page. Do not use China as a recovery area for air operations. The Chinese population has paid too high a price already. They remain willing to help, but it is not morally defensible to ask them again. Chennault closed by noting that this information was based on the best available intelligence, but could not be independently verified due to the scale of destruction and the difficulty of accessing affected areas. Doolittle put the letter down on his desk. He looked at the number again. 250,000. He tried to calculate how many people had helped his crews. He remembered the farmer who hid him, the older woman who brought rice, the nationalist soldiers who provided guides. He remembered other villages his crews mentioned, towns where doctors treated injuries, families who shared food, students who spoke English and served as translators. He had never asked for a complete accounting. The crews returned to American lines. That was what mattered operationally, but he knew the number was large. Hundreds of civilians at minimum, perhaps thousands across the entire province. Now those people were dead, not all of them. The casualty figure represented deaths across 2 provinces from military operations that targeted anyone suspected of helping Americans. But the people who actually helped his crews were certainly among the dead. They would have been the primary targets: the farmer who hid Doolittle, the woman who brought rice, the English-speaking students, the doctors, the guides. They would have been questioned first, executed first. Their villages would have been burned first. Doolittle had killed people before. He had bombed Tokyo, He had led bombing missions in North Africa. He understood that civilians died in war, but those deaths were incidental to military objectives. Bombs fell on industrial targets and sometimes missed and hit residential areas. That was the nature of strategic bombing. This was different. These civilians died because they helped Americans. They died specifically and deliberately as punishment for an act of mercy. They saved American lives, and Japanese forces killed them for it. He opened his desk drawer and took out the first letter from Chennault, dated June. That letter had mentioned reprisal operations, but provided no casualty figures. Doolittle had read it, filed it, and continued with his duties. He had not requested additional information. He had not asked intelligence officers to investigate. He had assumed the situation was serious, but manageable. Now he had the details. 250,000 dead. Operations concluded. The killing was finished. The information was historical. There was nothing to do except know it. He thought about writing a response to Chennault. He considered several options. He could request a formal investigation through military channels. He could ask for a detailed list of affected villages. He could recommend that the information be forwarded to the War Department with a request for public acknowledgement. He considered each option and rejected it. An investigation would require resources that did not exist in China. A detailed list would not change anything. Public acknowledgement would create political complications without helping anyone who was still alive. He put both letters in a folder and placed the folder in his file box with other classified correspondence. He locked the box and returned to work. Operation Torch was scheduled for November 8th. He had 2 months to prepare 500 aircraft for the largest amphibious invasion in American history. His responsibilities included coordinating with Navy squadrons, British air units, and ground forces. He had targets to select, flight plans to approve, logistics networks to organize, personnel assignments to finalize. The work required complete attention. He gave it complete attention. The invasion succeeded. Allied forces secured their objectives. Doolittle received orders to prepare for operations in Tunisia. He established new headquarters. He planned bombing campaigns against German supply lines. He lost aircraft to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. He attended briefings and reviewed casualty reports and wrote letters to families. The war continued. The file box stayed locked. In February 1943, Doolittle returned to Washington for a war bond drive. The War Department organized public appearances. He spoke at defense plants and rallies. He gave interviews. The reporters asked about the Tokyo raid. They always asked about the Tokyo raid. The story had become mythology. Everyone knew the basic narrative. 16 bombers launched from a carrier, attacked Japan. Crews bailed out in China. Chinese civilians helped them escape. Doolittle received the Medal of Honor. The story emphasized American courage and Japanese vulnerability. The Chinese appeared as supporting characters in a drama about American heroism. At one event in New York, a reporter from Time magazine asked about regrets. The reporter was young, perhaps 25. He had a notebook and a pencil. He asked if Doolittle had any regrets about the raid. Doolittle looked at him for a moment before answering. He thought about the farmer in Zhejiang province. He thought about the folder in his file box in North Africa with Chennault's letters inside. He thought about the number, 250,000. He said that war involved difficult choices. He said the raid achieved its objectives by demonstrating American resolve and damaging Japanese morale. He said he was proud of his crews and grateful to the Chinese who saved their lives. The reporter wrote it down. Then the reporter asked the follow-up question. Would you do it again? The reporter asked it casually, as if it was obvious what the answer would be. Would you do the raid again, knowing what you know now? Doolittle understood what the reporter was actually asking. The reporter wanted confirmation that the raid was worth it. The reporter wanted a statement affirming American heroism. The reporter had no knowledge of Chennault's letters, or the casualty figures, or the systematic destruction of Chinese villages. The reporter knew the public story: heroic raid, Chinese helpers, American triumph. Would you do it again? Doolittle said yes. He said it clearly and without hesitation. The raid was necessary. The mission succeeded. He would do it again. The reporter thanked him and moved to the next question. Someone else asked about the takeoff from the carrier. Doolittle described the procedure: short runway, heavy aircraft, precise timing. The audience listened. They were hearing a story they wanted to hear: American ingenuity overcoming impossible odds. The Chinese were mentioned briefly, brave allies who provided assistance. Then the conversation moved on. That night, Doolittle sat in his hotel room in New York and thought about the answer he had given. Would you do it again? Yes. He had said yes because that was the answer his role required. He was a general. He had led a successful operation. The operation had military and political value. Saying anything else would be inappropriate. It would suggest doubt. It would undermine morale. It would dishonor the men who flew the mission. It would question decisions made by higher authority. So he said yes. But the real answer was more complicated. The raid achieved its objectives. That was factually true. The raid also resulted in the deaths of 250,000 Chinese civilians. That was also factually true. Both things existed simultaneously. The raid was both a success and a catastrophe. Doolittle understood this. He understood it completely, and he had chosen to affirm the success and omit the catastrophe because that was what his position demanded. He returned to North Africa in March. The file box went with him. Fighting continued in Tunisia. American forces took casualties at Kasserine Pass. Air operations intensified. Doolittle reorganized squadrons and flew combat missions and requisitioned equipment. In April, he was promoted to Major General. In July, he transferred to England to prepare for strategic bombing operations against Germany. In January 1944, he took command of the 8th Air Force. He led 1,000-bomber raids over German industrial targets. He coordinated with British Bomber Command. He developed tactics for long-range fighter escorts. The air war over Europe consumed everything. He kept a photograph on his desk, his crew from the Tokyo raid standing in front of their B-25 in California. All 5 men smiling: the bombardier, the navigator, the flight engineer, the gunner. They had all survived the raid. Chinese civilians had saved all of them. 2 of the crew members died later in the war, 1 in North Africa, 1 over Germany. Doolittle looked at the photograph when he worked late at night after mission reports were complete. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. Doolittle returned home. He was one of the most decorated generals in American history. The public celebrated him. He gave speeches. He attended ceremonies. He received honors. The Tokyo raid remained his most famous accomplishment. People asked about it constantly. He told the story they wanted to hear. The file box remained locked. The letters from Chennault stayed inside. The number stayed there on the page. 250,000 Chinese civilians killed in reprisal operations following the Doolittle raid. The information remained classified. No public announcement was ever made. The farmers and students and doctors and guides who saved American lives were never named. They died in villages whose destruction was recorded in Japanese military reports as successful anti-insurgency operations. Their deaths were filed as statistics. The statistics were classified. The classification ensured that the heroic story could continue without complication. Doolittle never spoke publicly about the letters, not during the war, not after. The farmer's face stayed with him, the smile, the wave goodbye, the hand extended in trust. The knowledge stayed with him too, what that trust had cost, what his mission had cost people who owed him nothing and helped him anyway. He carried both, the medal and the knowledge, the public story and the classified truth. He carried them forward into peacetime and the rest of his life, and he said nothing. James Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946. He was 50 years old. He returned to Shell Oil as a vice president and later served on corporate boards. He lived in California with his wife. He gave speeches occasionally. He attended aviation events. He remained famous. People recognized him in airports and restaurants. They thanked him for his service. They asked about the Tokyo raid. He answered their questions politely. In 1946, the surviving members of the raid formed an association. They called themselves the Doolittle Raiders. They held annual reunions. The first reunion was informal. 15 men gathered at a hotel in Miami. They drank and told stories. Over the years, the reunions became more organized, more formal. By the 1950s, the city of Dayton, Ohio, hosted an annual event. The Raiders gathered at the Air Force Museum. They gave interviews to local television stations. They signed autographs. They posed for photographs. In 1959, the city of Tucson presented the Raiders with a gift: 80 silver goblets engraved with the names of all 80 crew members who flew the mission. The goblets were displayed in a special case at the Air Force Academy. Each year at the reunion, the surviving Raiders performed a ceremony. They opened the case. They turned upside down the goblets of Raiders who had died that year. Then they shared a toast using a bottle of cognac from 1896, the year Doolittle was born. The cognac was reserved for the final toast when only 2 Raiders remained alive. Doolittle attended every reunion. He was the commanding officer. The men looked to him. He gave brief remarks each year. He thanked the surviving Raiders for their service. He honored those who had passed. He spoke about courage and duty. He never mentioned China except to note that Chinese allies had helped the crews escape. The remarks were always brief. Then the formal program ended and the Raiders socialized. They remembered the mission. They remembered the takeoff. They remembered the fear and excitement. They remembered being young. No Chinese civilians were ever invited to the reunions. No one suggested it. The official narrative of the raid focused on American courage and ingenuity. The Chinese appeared in the story as helpers, background figures who provided assistance and then disappeared from the narrative. There was no ceremony for them, no goblets, no toast. Their names were not engraved on anything. In 1964, Doolittle was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. President Lyndon Johnson presented it at a White House ceremony. The citation praised Doolittle's contributions to aviation and his leadership during World War II. The Tokyo raid was mentioned specifically. Johnson said the raid had demonstrated American resolve at a critical moment. He said it had inspired the nation and proved that Japan was vulnerable. Doolittle accepted the medal. Photographers took pictures. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. That same year, a journalist asked Doolittle about writing his memoirs. Publishers were interested. The journalist said Americans wanted to hear the full story of his life. Doolittle agreed to the project. He worked with a co-author. They spent 2 years conducting interviews and reviewing documents. The book was published in 1966. It was titled, "I Could Never Be So Lucky Again." The book covered his entire life, his childhood, his racing career, his military service. The Tokyo raid received significant attention. 3 chapters described the planning, execution, and aftermath. The chapters about the raid mentioned Chinese assistance. Doolittle wrote about bailing out in Zhejiang province. He described the farmer who hid him. He wrote that Chinese civilians and soldiers saved the lives of most crew members at great personal risk. He expressed gratitude. The chapters did not mention Japanese reprisal operations. They did not mention casualty figures. They did not mention Chennault's letters. The classified information remained classified. Doolittle's memoir presented the public version of events. The book sold well. Reviewers praised it as an inspiring account of an American hero. In the 1970s, some documents related to the raid were declassified. Military historians gained access to operational reports and intelligence assessments. They published articles about the raid's planning and execution. They analyzed its strategic impact. They debated whether the raid had significant military value or was primarily a morale operation. The debates focused on American decision-making and tactical effectiveness. Chinese casualties were not part of the discussion. The relevant documents remained classified. Doolittle continued attending the annual reunions. Each year, fewer raiders remained. The goblets were turned upside down one by one. By 1980, only 30 raiders were still alive. By 1990, only 15. The ceremonies became more solemn. Television crews filmed the events. Newspapers published feature stories. The coverage emphasized the passage of time and the importance of remembering. The raiders were in their 70s and 80s. They were honored as members of the greatest generation. They had served their country in a just war. They had risked their lives for freedom. The narrative was clean and uncomplicated. Doolittle gave his last major interview in 1991. He was 95 years old. His health was declining, but his memory remained sharp. The interviewer asked about his greatest accomplishment. Doolittle said the Tokyo raid. The interviewer asked what made it special. Doolittle said it proved that Americans could strike back. He said it gave people hope when hope was scarce. He said he was proud of his crew and grateful for the opportunity to serve. The interviewer asked if he had any regrets. Doolittle paused before answering. He said war always involved regrets. He said good people died in war. He said he wished fewer people had to die. Then he said that was the nature of war. The interview ended. It was broadcast on national television. James Doolittle died on September 27, 1993. He was 96 years old. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Full military honors, honor guard, flag-draped coffin, a flyover of military aircraft including a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The vice president attended. Senior military officers attended. Surviving Doolittle raiders attended. The ceremony was formal and dignified. Eulogies praised his courage, leadership, and contributions to aviation. The Tokyo raid was mentioned in every speech. He was buried with full honors. His gravestone listed his rank and decorations. It mentioned the Medal of Honor. It mentioned the Tokyo raid. The classified files remained classified for 2 more years. In 1995, documents related to Japanese operations in China during World War II were declassified as part of a routine review. The documents included operational reports from the 13th Army describing the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. The reports contained casualty estimates. They described systematic destruction of villages. They identified the Doolittle raid as the precipitating event. Historians discovered the documents while researching other topics. They published their findings in academic journals. The information reached Chinese researchers. In the early 2000s, historians in China began documenting the reprisal operations in detail. They interviewed survivors. They examined Japanese military records. They compiled lists of destroyed villages. They attempted to identify individual victims. The work was painstaking. Many villages no longer existed. Many records had been destroyed. Many survivors had died. But the researchers persisted. In 2015, a Chinese historian named Hu Qingjie published a comprehensive study. The study listed villages destroyed during the operation. It provided estimated casualty figures for each location. It included testimony from survivors. It presented the most complete accounting available of what had happened in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces in 1942. The casualty estimate was 250,000. The figure matched Chennault's original assessment from 73 years earlier. Hu's study included a section on individual stories. One entry described a village in Zhejiang province. The village had hidden American airmen in April 1942. Japanese forces arrived in May. They questioned the village headman. He admitted helping Americans. The soldiers executed him. They executed 12 other men. They burned the village. The surviving villagers fled. After the war, some returned and rebuilt. By 2015, most of the survivors were dead. One woman remained. She had been 14 years old in 1942. She remembered the Americans. She remembered hiding them in her family's home. She remembered the soldiers coming. She remembered running. The historian interviewed her. She said the Americans were polite. She said they seemed grateful. She said they left, and she never saw them again. She said her father and 2 brothers were executed. She said she never learned the Americans' names. The study was published in Chinese and later translated into English. It circulated among academic historians. Some American scholars cited it in papers about the Pacific War. The information did not reach general public awareness in the United States. The Doolittle raid remained famous as a story of American heroism. The Chinese casualties remained a footnote in specialized academic literature. The Doolittle Raiders continued their annual reunions. By 2013, only 4 raiders remained alive. They gathered in November at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. They performed the goblet ceremony. They turned the goblets upside down for those who had died. They opened the bottle of 1896 cognac. They shared the final toast. Television cameras recorded the ceremony. News outlets published stories. The coverage called it the end of an era, the last gathering of the men who bombed Tokyo, the last survivors of a legendary mission. One of the 4 surviving raiders was interviewed. He was 97 years old. The reporter asked what he remembered most about the raid. The raider said he remembered the Chinese people who saved his life. He said they were kind and brave. He said he owed them everything. The reporter asked if he knew what happened to them. The raider said no. He said he never learned their names. He said he wished he could have thanked them properly. The interview was brief. The story focused on the raiders themselves, their age, their service, their place in history. The last Doolittle raider died in 2019. His name was Richard Cole. He had been Doolittle's co-pilot. He was 103 years old. His funeral was held in Texas. Veterans organizations attended. Military aircraft performed a flyover. Obituaries called him the last survivor of the raid that changed the war. The obituaries mentioned Chinese assistance in 1 or 2 sentences. They noted that civilians had helped the crews escape. They did not mention what happened to those civilians afterward. The 80 silver goblets remain on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. All 80 are turned upside down now. Visitors can view them in a special exhibit about the Doolittle raid. The exhibit includes photographs of the raiders, maps of the flight route, a restored B-25 bomber. Video screens show interviews with surviving raiders from years past. One section describes the escape through China. A placard states that Chinese civilians and soldiers helped the American crews reach safety. The placard does not mention the reprisal operations. It does not mention casualty figures. It does not list the names of any Chinese civilians. In China, memorials exist in some of the affected areas. Small monuments in villages that were destroyed and rebuilt. Plaques listing names of local victims. The memorials are modest. They receive few visitors. They are maintained by local historical societies and descendants of survivors. The monuments do not mention the Doolittle raid specifically. They describe Japanese military operations and civilian casualties. They list dates and numbers. They preserve names that would otherwise be lost. No American official ever formally acknowledged the Chinese casualties or their connection to the Doolittle raid. No apology was offered. No memorial was proposed. The information existed in declassified documents available to researchers. It was published in academic studies. It was known, but it was not part of the public story. The public story remained unchanged. Brave American airmen struck Japan. Chinese allies helped them escape. The raid boosted morale and demonstrated American resolve. It was a turning point, a moment of inspiration, a legendary achievement. The farmer who hid Doolittle was never identified. His name does not appear in any surviving record. The village where he lived was destroyed. Whether he died in the reprisal operations or survived and rebuilt his life remains unknown. There is no grave marker, no memorial plaque, no photograph. He existed as a figure in Doolittle's memory. The smile, the wave, the hand extended in trust. He existed as one name among 250,000 casualties in Hu Qingjie's study. A statistic representing a life about which nothing more is known. The bottle of 1896 cognac was empty after the 2013 reunion. The goblets remain on display. The story continues to be told, and the names of the Chinese dead remain unspoken.